In this part of toxicity tests, we're going to look at the eye irritation-corrosion tests. The eye irritation-corrosion test is an acute toxicity test. It is sometimes referred to as the Draize Eye test. I'm going to start this piece by reading an abstract from the Survey of Ophthalmology, which is an international review journal. This abstract is by Kirk R. Wilhelmus, and it was written in May 2001. The abstract reads, "Hundreds of substances are used daily that can damage eyesight. People's eyes are open to accidental or intentional exposure during the production, transportation, use and disposal of chemical preparations." Ensuring the safety of consumer products was born during the mid-20th century in the aftermath of chemical warfare research, and was motivated by the hazards of unsafe cosmetics. Justified by an exigency for public protection, the Draize Eye test became a governmentally endorsed method to evaluate the safety of materials meant for use in or around the eyes. The test involves a standardized protocol for instilling agents onto the cornea and conjunctiva of laboratory animals. A sum of ordinal scale items of the outer eye gives an index of ocular morbidity. Advances in ocular toxicology are challenging the validity, precision, relevance and need of the Draize Eye test. Preclinical product safety tests with rabbits and other mammals also raise ethical concerns of animal well-being. Some use the Draize test as a rallying point for how animals are treated in science and industry. A battery of cellular systems and computer models aims to reduce and ultimately to replace whole animal testing. Molecular measures of ocular toxicity may eventually allow comprehensive screening in humans. The Draize Eye test was created and refined for humanitarian reasons and has, assuredly, prevented harm. Its destiny is to be progressively supplanted as in vitro and clinical alternatives emerge for assessing irritancy of the ocular surface. This time, instead of looking at an OECD test, I thought I would have a look at a European Union test. However, after finally tracking down the test, I was surprised to discover it's exactly the same as the OECD test. In fact, most of the European Union tests on first inspection seem to be identical to the OECD tests. I expect the Environmental Protection Agency in the USA has exactly the same tests as well. The slide in front of you is a page from the official journal of the European Union. It is the front of Commission Directive 2004/73/EC, and it relates to the classification, packaging and labelling of dangerous substances. Within the directive you will eventually scroll down to the Acute Toxicity Eye Irritation/Corrosion Test. As you can see, under Method it says, "This method is equivalent to the OECD TG405 test." The first thing we need to do is to define what we mean by eye irritation. Here within the test it says eye irritation is the production of changes in the eye following the application of a test substance to the anterior surface of the eye, which are fully reversible within 21 days of application. Eye corrosion is defined as the production of tissue damage in the eye or serious physical decay of vision following application of a test substance to the anterior surface of the eye, which is not fully reversible within 21 days of application. This is the horrible part of the test. Both parts are not very nice, but this one is particularly awful. Now that we've defined what irritation and corrosion are, we can look at how the test is undertaken. This slide reads, The substance to be tested is applied in a single dose to one of the eyes of the experimental animal. The untreated eye serves as the control. The degree of eye irritation corrosion is evaluated by scoring lesions, which is a word for injuries, of the conjunctiva, cornea and iris at specific intervals. Other effects in the eye and adverse systemic effects are also described to provide a complete evaluation of the effects. The duration of the study should be sufficient to evaluate the reversibility or irreversibility of the effects. This slide informs the animal experimenter which animal is to be used in the Irritation-Corrosion eye test. It won't come as any surprise to know that the preferred species is the albino rabbit. I say it won't be a surprise because most people have seen the horrible pictures of the eye injuries that these poor rabbits have had to endure, especially in the corrosion part of the test, where the damage is often irreversible. Anyway, the last two lines of this slide read, "The albino rabbit is the preferable laboratory animal, and healthy young adult animals are used. A rationale for using other strains or species should be provided." This slide gives a little bit more detail about the test procedure, specifically about the application of the test substance. It reads, "The test substance should be placed in the conjunctival sac of one eye of each animal after gently pulling the lower lid away from the eyeball. The lids are then gently held together for about 1 second in order to prevent loss of the material. The other eye, which remains untreated, serves as a control." The second paragraph of this slide reads, "Irrigation. The eyes of the test animals should not be washed for at least 24 hours following instillation of the test substance, except for solids, and in case of immediate corrosive or irritating effects. At 24 hours a washout may be used if considered appropriate." This shows what the rabbits have to go through. They have to test liquids in their eyes, they have to test solids in their eyes, and they have to test aerosols. And if we go down to the third paragraph, which deals with testing of aerosols, it says, "It is recommended that all pump sprays and aerosols be collected prior to instillation into the eye. The one exception is for substances in pressurized aerosol containers, which cannot be collected due to vaporization. In such cases, the eye should be held open and the test substance administered to the eye in a simple burst of about 1 second from a distance of 10 centimeters directly in front of the eye." This must be pretty horrendous for the animals, I think most people would agree. The testing of solids doesn't sound too good either. This one reads, "When testing solids, pastes and particulate substances, the amount should have a volume of 0.1 milliliters or a weight of not more than 100 milligrams. The test material should be ground to a fine dust, and then obviously it's going to be put into the eye of the rabbit." I mean, again, fairly horrendous stuff this is. This next slide is about clinical observations and grading of eye reactions. It's not particularly pleasant reading. Anyway, I'll quickly run through it. It says the eye should be examined at 1, 24, 48 and 72 hours after test substance application. Animals should be kept on test no longer than necessary once definitive information has been obtained. Animals showing continuing severe pain or distress should be humanely killed without delay and the substance assessed accordingly. Animals with the following eye lesions post-installation should be humanely killed: corneal perforation or significant corneal ulceration, including staphyloma, blood in the anterior chamber of the eye, grade 4 corneal opacity, which persists for 48 hours, absence of a light reflex, iridile response grade 2, which persists for 72 hours, ulceration of the conjunctival membrane, necrosis of the conjunctiva or nictitating membrane, or sloughing. This is because such lesions generally are not reversible. The last paragraph reads, "The grading of ocular responses is necessarily subjective. To promote harmonization of grading of ocular response and to assist testing laboratories and those involved in making and interpreting the observations, the personnel performing the observations need to be adequately trained in the scoring system used." The only reason I read this out is because of the first sentence. The grading of ocular responses is necessarily subjective. It shouldn't be subjective. I mean, objective pictures and things should be laid down in a book that they can compare to, so that's poor science. But the other thing is, yes, the grading of ocular responses is necessarily subjective, but also what is subjective is measuring the pain of the rabbit. This last slide, like all of these tests, shows the results, discussion of results and interpretation of the results. The significant paragraph obviously is this one. Extrapolation of the results of eye irritation studies in laboratory animals to humans is valid only to a limited degree. In many cases, the albino rabbit is more sensitive than humans to ocular irritants or corrosives. So you're not even going to get accurate results that can be extrapolated to human eyes from all this suffering that the rabbits have to go through. So what alternative tests exist to replace the Draize Eye Irritation / Corrosion tests? Here we are again looking at the Canadian Council on Animal Care's website. As you can see, eye irritation corrosion is highlighted. This second slide from the Canadian Council on Animal Care's website shows in the left-hand column the conventional test method is the Acute Eye Irritation / Corrosion Test, otherwise known as the Draize Rabbit Eye Irritation Test, and this is OECD TG 405. The first alternative test in the second column is the bovine corneal opacity and permeability test method, and the validation status of that test is, in the EU it is endorsed as valid by the ESAC, which is the European Scientific Advisory Committee, and that was validated in 2007. And in the US it's endorsed as valid by the Interagency Coordinating Committee on the Validation Alternative Methods, and again that was in 2007. Under regulatory status it says OECD draft new test guideline. In the EU is accepted for use to positively identify and label substances as severe eye irritants. And in the US it says it is accepted as a screening test to detect ocular corrosives and severe irritants in a tiered testing strategy. And under effects or potential effects on animal use it says reduction. Substances identified as irritants by test will not progress to animal testing. The second test, under name and description of an alternative test, is the isolated chicken eye test method, and the validation status is, in the EU it is endorsed as valid by the ESAC, and in the US it is endorsed as valid by the ICCVAM. The regulatory status: OECD draft new test guideline, EU accepted for use to positively identify and label substances as severe eye irritants, and in the US it is accepted as a screening test to detect ocular corrosives and severe irritants in a tiered testing strategy. And again, it is a reduction test, as substances identified as irritants by test will not progress to animal testing. This third slide shows 3 more alternative tests. The first one reads hen's egg test, and in the EU they have concluded that it's not sufficiently validated by the ESAC yet, and in the US concluded again that it's not sufficiently validated by the ICCVAM. In the EU under regulatory status, it says, although not formally validated, it is accepted for use to positively identify and label substances as severe eye irritants. And in how it will affect animals, this column, it says reduction. Substances identified as irritants by test will not progress to animal testing. The next one down is the isolated rabbit eye test method. In the EU they have concluded that it's not sufficiently validated, and in the US they have concluded again that it's not sufficiently validated. In the EU they have said that although it is not formally validated, it is accepted for use to positively identify and label substances as severe eye irritants. And again, it is a reduction test, as substances identified as irritants by test will not progress to animal testing. The last alternative test is the slug mucosal irritation assay, and in the EU under validation status it says pre-validation study results have been submitted to the ECVAM for evaluation. ECVAM stands for European Centre for the Validation of Alternative Methods. Under regulatory status there's no information, and how it will affect animals, it could be a full replacement test. Quickly looking at some of the descriptions of the test, this one is the first one that we mentioned, the bovine corneal opacity and permeability test method. It reads, exposes isolated bovine cornea obtained from slaughterhouses to the test substance. Evaluates permeability to fluorescent dye and the change in transmission of light through the cornea, corneal opacity, to determine the irritation or corrosion potential of a test substance. We've already talked about the validation and the regulatory status, so I won't go over that again, but obviously there is a problem here for vegans and vegetarians because there aren't going to be any eyes from the slaughterhouses. I've skipped over the isolated chicken eye test method because it's exactly the same as the bovine corneal opacity and permeability test method, but with an isolated chicken eye. So now I'm going to look at the hen's egg test. The description of the hen's egg test is as follows. Exposes the chorionic membrane of embryonated chicken eggs to test compound and evaluates acute effects on the small blood vessels and proteins of this soft tissue membrane to identify materials that are severely irritating to the eye. The test method is based on the observation that the CAM, which stands for causal analog model, of an embryonated hen's egg is similar to the vascularized mucosal tissues of the eye. The first 2 tests wouldn't be acceptable to vegans or vegetarians. However, this test would be acceptable to vegetarians but not vegans. However, I think everyone would accept that it's a massive improvement on the Draize Eye Irritation corrosion test that takes place currently. This 4th alternative test is called the isolated rabbit eye test method, and the description of it reads, exposes isolated rabbit's eyes obtained from animals previously euthanized for research or those commercially sacrificed to a test substance and evaluates corneal swelling, corneal opacity, fluorescent retention and effects on the corneal epithelium. This test wouldn't be acceptable to either vegans or vegetarians because an animal has to die for it to take place. This last alternative test is called the slug mucosal irritation assay, and the description reads, slugs are exposed to the test compound, then assessed for amount of mucus produced, as well as the concentration of proteins and enzymes released from the slug's body wall. I don't like 3 of the tests because an animal has to die before the test can be undertaken, and the other one is tested on an egg, and I'm a vegan, so still ethical problems there for me. However, this one disgusts me more than all of the other 4 because it is on a living sentient being. The being is still alive while the experiment is taking place, and I think a lot of people will be disgusted by this test.